The rain struck like bullets against Ethan's face as he fought to stay mounted. Lightning split the sky, revealing chaos. His entire herd scattered across the flooded pasture, bellowing in terror. Through the sheets of water, he saw something impossible. A figure moving through the stampede with impossible grace, hands outstretched, voice cutting through the thunder. The woman's silhouette flickered like a ghost between the frantic animals, guiding them toward shelter, with movements that seemed to defy the storm's rage. Ethan's heart hammered. No one could survive out there. His vision blurred. Was she even real? The Texas sky had been threatening all afternoon, building into something darker than Ethan Walker had seen in his 38 years on the land. The air hung thick and metallic, pressing against his chest as he secured the barn doors with trembling hands. His cattle, 63 head, every one of them representing borrowed money and borrowed time, grazed restlessly in the east pasture, their low calls carrying an ancient warning. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead despite the dropping temperature. The bank had given him until harvest season to catch up on the mortgage, but if he lost the herd, there would be nothing left to negotiate. 5 years of drought, medical bills from his father's final illness, and equipment failures had carved him down to this. One last chance wrapped in hide and horn. The first drops hit like stones. Within minutes, the sky opened with biblical fury. Rain didn't fall. It attacked, horizontal sheets driven by winds that bent the fence posts and ripped shingles from the barn roof. Thunder rolled across the plains in continuous waves, each crash louder than the last, until the sound became physical force pressing against his eardrums. Ethan ran for his horse, Duke, who danced nervously in his stall. Through the barn's open door, he could see the pasture transforming into churning mud, and beyond it, his cattle beginning to scatter. Panic spread through the herd like wildfire, the ancient prey instinct that turned domestic animals back into wild creatures fleeing invisible predators. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered, swinging into the saddle with practiced speed. His hands shook as he gripped the reins. Losing even 10 head would cripple him. Losing 30 would end everything. Before we continue this incredible journey, I need to ask something important. This channel is built on bringing you powerful emotional stories like Maggie's, stories that need to be told. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers so we can keep creating content that moves you, surprises you, and stays with you long after the video ends. If this story is touching your heart, please hit that subscribe button right now. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring more unforgettable stories to life. Duke plunged into the storm, and immediately, Ethan understood the true magnitude of what they faced. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Lightning strikes hit so close he could smell the ozone, could feel the electricity making his hair stand on end. The rain stung his face like needles, and the wind roared with voices that seemed almost human. His cattle were everywhere and nowhere, dark shapes moving in chaos, calves separated from mothers, the big bull Samson charging in circles trying to gather his herd through instinct alone. Ethan's throat went raw from shouting commands that were swallowed by the tempest before they left his mouth. Then he saw her. At first she was just a shadow, a trick of lightning and rain, but the shadow moved with purpose through the stampede, weaving between the panicked animals, with movements that seemed choreographed. Ethan's breath caught. No one else lived within 5 miles. No one would be insane enough to be out here. Another lightning strike illuminated the scene for 3 heartbeats, and Ethan's world tilted. The woman, it was definitely a woman, soaked through, hair plastered to her skull, stood directly in front of a charging cow, arms spread wide. Instead of being trampled, she made a sharp gesture, a specific movement of her hands and body, and the cow turned. Actually turned away, as if responding to a language Ethan had forgotten existed. She was using the old techniques, the ones his grandfather had known, before modern methods and machinery. Techniques that required reading animal behavior like text, understanding their fear, speaking to them through posture and sound rather than force. Ethan tried to ride closer, but Duke reared as another lightning bolt split a fence post 30 yards away. The crack was deafening, the smell of burning wood mixing with rain and mud. When Ethan regained control and looked back, The woman had moved to the far edge of the herd, guiding a group of calves toward higher ground near the old windbreak. His mind screamed that this couldn't be happening. People didn't appear in the middle of nowhere during monster storms. People didn't walk through stampedes unharmed. His exhausted brain offered the only explanation that made sense: hallucination. Stress-induced mirages born from desperation and fear. But the calves were moving. The herd was slowly, impossibly being gathered. Ethan urged Duke forward again, fighting to reach the mysterious figure. He had to know if she was real, had to understand what was happening. The mud sucked at the horses' hooves, and the wind pushed them sideways with each step. A flash of white light consumed everything. The thunderclap arrived simultaneously. No gap, no warning. The lightning had struck something close, too close. The force of it threw Ethan's senses into chaos. His vision went white, then dark. He felt himself slipping from the saddle, felt Duke stagger beneath him. In his final moment of consciousness, through the rain and fading vision, he saw her one more time. She was dragging the last panicked Becerro toward the makeshift shelter of the collapsed fence line. Her body bent against the wind, refusing to give up even as the storm tried to destroy everything. Then, darkness claimed him, and Ethan Walker fell into the mud, not knowing if the angel he'd seen was real or simply the last mercy his mind could offer before the end. Consciousness returned in fragments, the taste of wet earth, the distant rumble of thunder moving east, and cold. Bone-deep cold that made Ethan's muscles lock as he tried to move. His face was pressed against mud, and for a terrible moment he couldn't remember where he was or why every inch of his body screamed in protest. Then memory flooded back. The storm, the cattle, the woman. Ethan forced his eyes open. Dawn light filtered through dissipating clouds, painting everything in shades of grey and silver. He was lying near the windbreak, Duke standing loyal watch a few feet away, reins tangled in the broken fence. The horse's coat was caked with mud, but he appeared unharmed, just exhausted. Slowly, painfully, Ethan pushed himself to his knees. The world spun, and he tasted blood from where he'd bitten his tongue during the fall. His left shoulder throbbed, probably dislocated when he hit the ground, but that pain faded to nothing when he looked toward the pasture. His cattle stood in a tight group near the old equipment shed, calm as Sunday morning. Every single head accounted for, even from this distance. The calves pressed close to their mothers, the bull Samson positioned protectively at the herd's edge. They looked tired but unharmed, as if the nightmare of the previous night had been a shared dream they were now waking from. It was impossible. In a storm like that, he should have lost half the herd to stampede injuries, lightning strikes, or simple exhaustion. Calves should have drowned in the flash floods that had turned low-lying areas into temporary lakes. Yet there they stood, together, saved by something Ethan couldn't begin to explain. Then he saw her. The woman sat on an overturned water trough 20 yards away, her back to him, shoulders slumped forward in absolute exhaustion. Her clothes, jeans and what had once been a plaid shirt, hung in tatters, shredded by wire fences and rough wood. Even from behind, Ethan could see the cuts on her arms, the way her hands trembled as she tried to wipe mud from her face. She was real. Not a hallucination, not a ghost, but flesh and blood, and someone who had nearly killed herself saving his livelihood. Ethan tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "Hey," he called out, his voice a broken rasp. "Hey, wait." The woman's head turned slightly, acknowledging she'd heard, but she didn't move. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the cattle's low murmurs, and water dripping from every surface as the land tried to absorb the deluge. Finally, using Duke's stirrup for support, Ethan managed to stand. Each step toward her felt like walking through concrete, but he forced himself forward. As he got closer, he could see more details, the grey threaded through her dark hair, the weathered quality of her hands that spoke of years of hard labor, the set of her jaw that suggested she'd learned long ago not to expect gratitude. "You saved them," Ethan said when he reached her. Up close, he could see she was probably in her mid-40s, with eyes the color of creek water after rain. Those eyes held something ancient and sad, like they'd witnessed things that couldn't be spoken aloud. She nodded once, a minimal gesture. Seemed like the right thing to do. Her voice was rough from shouting over the storm, But there was steadiness underneath, an unshakable quality that reminded Ethan of old oak roots. How? The question came out sharper than he intended. How did you even know? How did you get them to listen? The woman looked away toward the cattle, and something complicated crossed her face, pain mixed with pride, memory tangled with loss. I know these lands. Knew them before you did, probably. Knew them when they had different fences, different names on the deed. She stood, wincing as her body protested, and Ethan saw the full extent of what the night had cost her. Her left leg bore a deep gash that still oozed blood. Her right hand hung at an odd angle, fingers possibly broken. There were bruises forming along her collarbone, and when she moved, she favored her ribs in a way that suggested cracked bones. "You need a doctor," Ethan said. "Hospital, right now." "I need to go home." She started walking, limping heavily toward the property line that bordered his land to the north. "Wait." Ethan grabbed her shoulder gently, and she flinched, not from pain, but from something deeper. The reflex of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from human contact. "At least tell me your name. I need to know who to thank." She studied him for a long moment, those creek-water eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied some internal test, because her expression softened just slightly. "Margaret Collins," she said. "People call me Maggie, though not many people call me anything these days." "Where do you live? How did you even get here?" Maggie pointed toward the northern hills where a line of trees marked the old property boundary. "The cabin up there, the one everyone says is abandoned." Her lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Been there 5 years now, watching these lands, watching that herd, watching you struggle to keep it all together." The words should have felt invasive, but instead they carried an odd comfort. Someone had been watching. Someone had cared enough to notice. "Why?" Ethan asked. "Why risk your life for my cattle?" Maggie was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of ghosts. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything to a storm you never saw coming. And because," she paused, something breaking in her expression, "because my husband died trying to save cattle on this land, someone had to finish what he started." She turned and walked away before Ethan could respond, limping through the mud-churned pasture toward the distant tree line. He watched her go, his mind racing with questions that multiplied with every step she took. Who was her husband? When did he die? And why had no one ever told Ethan about the woman living in the abandoned cabin, the widow who knew his land better than he did? Most importantly, why did watching her walk away feel like losing something precious he'd only just discovered existed? 3 days passed before Ethan saw Maggie again. 3 days of cleaning up storm damage, repairing fences, and checking each animal for injuries that miraculously barely existed. A few scrapes, one sprained leg on a yearling, but nothing serious. Nothing that matched the catastrophe the storm should have delivered. The town buzzed with talk of the freak weather system that had stalled over the county for 6 hours. Other ranchers reported devastating losses: drowned cattle, collapsed barns, miles of destroyed fencing. Old Jim Peterson lost 20 head when lightning struck his water tank, electrocuting everything nearby. The Martinez family's entire chicken operation was wiped out when their coops were torn apart by the wind. Only Ethan Walker's place had survived intact. People called it luck, miracle, divine intervention. None of them knew about the woman in the storm. Ethan didn't correct them. Something told him Maggie wouldn't want the attention, wouldn't want questions she'd spent 5 years avoiding, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, the way she'd moved through the chaos, the profound sadness in her eyes, the mention of a husband who'd died on this land. On the 4th morning, he saddled Duke and rode toward the northern boundary. The cabin sat nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Ethan had passed this way dozens of times and never noticed it, never thought to wonder who might live in the structure everyone assumed had been empty for decades. As he approached, details emerged. The cabin was small but well-maintained, roof patched with careful precision, windows clean despite lacking curtains, a vegetable garden showing signs of recent harvest, chickens scratched in a tidy coop, a water barrel collected runoff from the roof. Everything spoke of someone living deliberately, carefully, without waste or excess. Maggie emerged from the door before he could dismount, wiping her hands on an apron that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify. She looked better than the last time he'd seen her. The cuts on her arms bandaged, the limp less pronounced, but there was wariness in her posture. "Mr. Walker," she said neutrally. Not unfriendly, but not welcoming either. "Ethan, please." He dismounted, keeping Duke's reins in hand. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were healing up." "I'm fine." She crossed her arms, a gesture that was equal parts defense and determination. "Healing's something I'm good at. And I wanted to thank you properly. What you did." His voice caught. "I would have lost everything. The bank would have foreclosed. My grandfather's land, my father's legacy, all of it gone." Something shifted in Maggie's expression. "Your grandfather," she repeated softly. "Would that be Henry Walker? You knew him. Met him a few times. Good man. Fair." She looked past Ethan toward the distant house and barns. He knew how to read the land, respect it, knew that these plains have their own language if you're willing to listen. Ethan felt like he was circling something important, some truth that hovered just out of reach. "Maggie, you said your husband died here. What happened?" Her face closed off immediately, shutters dropping behind her eyes. For a moment he thought she'd send him away, but then she seemed to make a decision, shoulders sagging slightly, as if she'd been carrying a weight too long and was finally ready to set it down. "My husband was Daniel Collins. We worked for the previous owner, Marcus Brennan, before your family bought the place. Danny was the foreman, best cattleman in 3 counties. I learned everything from him. How to read weather in the animal's behavior. How to move a herd using pressure and release instead of force. How to survive in country that doesn't forgive mistakes." She walked toward a small bench near the garden, gesturing for Ethan to follow. When she sat, it was with the careful movements of someone whose body still carried old injuries. 10 years ago, there was another storm. Not as bad as the one last week, but bad enough. Marcus refused to let Danny bring the cattle in early. Said it would pass, said Danny was worrying over nothing. He was wrong. Maggie's hands twisted in her lap. The storm hit at night. Danny went out anyway, even though Marcus told him not to. He knew those cattle would scatter, knew they'd die without someone to guide them. He saved most of the herd, but a fence had come down near the creek. The water was rising fast. He went to fix it, to keep the cattle from being trapped against the flooding, and... Her voice broke. Ethan waited, not pushing, giving her the space to continue. "The current took him. They found his body 3 days later, caught in debris 5 miles downstream. Marcus paid for the funeral, gave me a month to clear out of the foreman's house, and that was it. No pension, no acknowledgement of what Danny had sacrificed. Just gone." If this story is resonating with you, if Maggie's strength and resilience are inspiring you the way they're inspiring Ethan, please take a moment to subscribe. We're building a community that believes in powerful storytelling, in giving voice to the forgotten and overlooked. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Hit that button and join us. Ethan felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. "That's not right. That's not anywhere close to right." "No," Maggie agreed quietly. "But it's how things are for people like me. People without power, without papers that say they matter. I moved up here to the old boundary cabin. It was falling apart, but it was shelter. Been here ever since, living off the garden, a few chickens, odd jobs when I can get them. Watching these lands that Danny loved, that he died protecting. Why didn't you come to me before? Why wait until the storm?" She met his eyes directly. "Because in my experience, wealthy landowners don't care much for poor widows offering advice. I figured you'd either throw me off the property or call me crazy. Safer to stay invisible, stay forgotten." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. How many times had he looked toward these northern hills and seen nothing? How many times had he passed within yards of someone who carried knowledge he desperately needed and never thought to look? How many people like Maggie existed in the shadows, rendered invisible by circumstance and neglect? "You're not forgotten anymore," Ethan said firmly. "And you're not invisible, not to me. The days that followed shifted into an unexpected rhythm. Ethan found himself riding to the northern cabin each morning, ostensibly to check on storm damage along the property line, but really to see Maggie. They would walk the fence lines together, her pointing out weaknesses he'd missed, sharing observations about the land that came from years of patient watching. She taught him things his grandfather had known, but never lived long enough to pass down. How to read the sky 3 days ahead by watching bird patterns, how to identify the exact moment cattle sensed predators by the angle of their ears, how to move through the herd without disturbing their natural hierarchy. Knowledge that couldn't be found in agricultural journals or university programs, only in the hands and hearts of people who'd made the land their life's study. In return, Ethan brought supplies she'd never asked for. A new water pump when he noticed hers sputtering, lumber for fence repairs, fresh vegetables from town when her garden couldn't provide variety. She accepted these offerings with quiet dignity, never thanking him excessively, understanding they weren't charity but exchange. Her knowledge for his resources, her experience for his willingness to learn. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Ethan finally asked the question that had been building in his chest for weeks. Why did you really risk your life that night? The truth, Maggie. Not just about finishing what Danny started. She was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. The chickens settled into their coop with soft murmurs. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The land exhaled as it always did when day surrendered to night, releasing the heat and tension of hours under the sun. "Because I saw you," Maggie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day for 5 years, I watched you fight for this place, watched you work yourself to exhaustion, trying to honor your father's memory, trying to prove you weren't going to be the generation that lost it all. I saw someone who cared about the land the way Danny cared about it. The way I still care about it?" She turned to face him, and in the fading light her eyes held something raw and honest. "And I couldn't bear to watch another good person lose everything to circumstances beyond their control. Couldn't watch this land pass into the hands of some corporation that would strip it bare and move on. So when that storm came, and I knew your cattle would scatter, I had a choice. Stay safe and invisible, or step into the chaos and try to save something worth saving." Ethan's throat tightened. "You could have died." "Yes." The word was simple, matter-of-fact. "But I've been half dead for 10 years anyway. At least that night, I was fully alive." The confession hung between them like something tangible. Ethan found himself reaching across the space that separated them, taking her weathered hand in his. Her fingers were rough with calluses, strong despite their scars, and they trembled slightly at his touch. "When I first saw you in that storm," he said slowly, "fighting through the rain and chaos, moving like you were part of the weather itself, I thought you were a mirage, something my exhausted mind conjured up because I needed saving so badly. I invented an angel." Maggie's lips curved in a sad smile. "I'm no angel, Ethan. Just a woman who knows cattle and weather." "No." His grip on her hand tightened. "You're someone who chose courage when everyone else chose forgetting. You're someone who saved a stranger's livelihood when you had every reason to stay hidden. He paused, surprised by the emotion thickening his voice. "You're the most real person I've met in years." Something shifted in the air between them, fragile and precious as new grass after rain. The space on the porch seemed to contract, drawing them closer without either consciously moving. Maggie's breath caught, and Ethan could see the war playing across her face, the part of her that wanted to lean into connection warring with the part that had learned isolation was safer than hope. "Ethan," she said carefully, "you don't owe me anything. What I did was my choice. You don't have to. This isn't about owing." The words came out fiercer than he intended. "This is about recognizing that the person who saved everything I care about has been living 20 yards from the property line, alone and forgotten for 5 years. This is about the fact that I can't stop thinking about how close I came to losing the farm and never knowing you existed." He stood, pacing to the porch railing, staring out at the darkening plains. "You talk about being invisible, but Maggie, you're the most visible thing in my world now. When I work the cattle, I hear your voice teaching me the old methods. When I check the weather, I remember how you read the storms. You've become woven into everything here, and I—" He turned back to her, and the vulnerability in her expression nearly broke him. She looked terrified and hopeful in equal measure, like someone who'd forgotten how to dream and was just remembering the skill. "I don't want you to be invisible anymore," Ethan finished quietly. "I want you to be here, fully here, as part of this place you never stopped loving." Maggie stood slowly, crossing to where he leaned against the railing. In the near darkness, her face was all shadows and moonlight, beautiful in the way weathered things are beautiful, marked by time and survival, made stronger by what tried to break them. "That's a dangerous want," she whispered, "for both of us." "Maybe," Ethan agreed. "But I've spent the last 5 years playing it safe, and I nearly lost everything anyway. Maybe it's time to be dangerous." Thunder rumbled in the distance, not threatening, just the land's nightly conversation with the sky. And in that moment, standing close enough to feel each other's warmth, Ethan and Maggie both understood that something irreversible had begun, something that would either heal them both or destroy what little safety they'd managed to build from their respective losses. The question was which path fate would choose, and whether they'd be brave enough to walk it together. The discovery came 3 weeks later, in the most mundane way possible. Ethan was organizing his father's office, sorting through boxes of documents that had accumulated over decades, old receipts, faded photographs, legal papers bundled with string that crumbled at his touch. The task was overdue, part of the endless list of things he'd avoided since his father's death 2 years earlier. In the bottom drawer of the old oak filing cabinet, beneath tax returns from the 1980s, he found a manila envelope marked "Property Transfer, Brennan Estate." His hands hesitated before opening it. Marcus Brennan had been the previous owner, the man who'd worked Danny Collins to death and discarded Maggie like trash afterward. Inside were the original deed transfers, survey maps, and correspondence between lawyers. Ethan spread them across the desk, expecting routine paperwork. What he found instead made his blood run cold. The northern 40 acres, the land where Maggie's cabin stood, had belonged to Daniel Collins. Not rented, not leased. Owned outright, purchased through a legitimate land grant program for agricultural workers in the early 2000s. The deed was clear, signed by county officials, and witnessed properly. But 6 months after Danny's death, a new document appeared. A quitclaim deed supposedly signed by Margaret Collins, transferring the property to Marcus Brennan for the sum of $1. Ethan stared at the signature, his legal training from community college kicking in despite the years since he'd used it. The signature was wrong. He'd seen Maggie's handwriting on the notes she left him about cattle management, on the lists she made for garden planning. Her letters had a distinctive slant, a particular way of forming capital M's. The signature on this document was nothing like her natural hand. Forged. The deed had been forged, and Maggie had been robbed of her legal inheritance in the chaos following her husband's death. Ethan's hands shook as he pulled out more documents, letters from Brennan's lawyers to Maggie, claiming she had no right to remain on the property. Eviction notices that were never properly served. A memo from Brennan to his attorney discussing how the widow won't fight. She doesn't have the resources or education to challenge us. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that Maggie's poverty and grief made her powerless, ignited something fierce in Ethan's chest. This was why she'd been living in a forgotten cabin, scraping by on chickens and vegetables, watching the land that should have been hers pass into other hands. This was why she'd learned to be invisible. Because visibility had gotten her everything stolen. When his grandfather, Henry Walker, had purchased the property from Brennan's estate after the old man's death, no one had mentioned the disputed northern 40 acres. It had been absorbed into the larger parcel, its complicated history buried in filing cabinets and convenient forgetting. His family had unknowingly built their renewed prosperity on land taken from a widow through fraud and manipulation. Ethan gathered every document, his mind already forming a plan. He knew the county clerk, knew which lawyer in town had a reputation for taking cases others wouldn't touch. He knew this would be complicated. 10 years had passed, multiple transfers had occurred, and the legal system moved slowly even for clear-cut injustices. But he also knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. That evening, he rode to Maggie's cabin with a flashlight and the envelope of documents. She was sitting on her porch as usual, mending a shirt by lamplight. When she saw his face, she set down her sewing immediately. "What's wrong?" Ethan dismounted and climbed the porch steps, his expression grim. "This land," he said, gesturing at the cabin and surrounding acres. "It's yours, Maggie. It was always yours." He watched confusion cross her face, followed by dawning comprehension as he explained what he'd found. With each revelation she grew paler, her hands gripping the porch railing as if it were the only solid thing in a tilting world. "He forged my signature," she whispered when Ethan finished. "Marcus Brennan stole my land, and I never knew. All these years I thought I'd lost it legally. Thought maybe Danny hadn't finished the payments or there was some clause I didn't understand." "You lost it to a crime," Ethan said firmly, "and I'm going to make it right." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "Ethan, you can't fight this. The legal fees alone would bankrupt you, and even if you won, what would it mean? The land's yours now. Your family paid for it fairly." "My family paid for stolen property. That doesn't make it ours." He took her hands, holding them steady. "Tomorrow, we're going to see lawyers. We're going to file claims, dig up witnesses, do whatever it takes. And if the town doesn't like it, if people think I'm crazy for giving up land, I don't care. Because this isn't about land anymore." He met her eyes, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. "It's about finally giving you back what was taken. It's about proving that people like Brennan don't get to win just because they have money and we have conscience." But as thunder rumbled in the distance, and Maggie's face reflected both hope and terror, neither of them knew that the fight ahead would uncover secrets far darker than simple fraud, secrets that would force them to choose between justice and survival. The legal battle took 6 months, 6 months of depositions, document analysis, and heated arguments in conference rooms that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The county clerk confirmed the signature on the quitclaim deed didn't match any other official documents Maggie had signed. A handwriting expert testified the forgery was amateurish, likely done in haste by someone who'd never studied her writing carefully. But the hardest part wasn't the legal technicalities. It was watching the town turn against them. The bank threatened foreclosure when Ethan used operating capital for legal fees. Neighbors who'd once waved in passing now crossed the street to avoid him. At the feed store, men muttered about outsiders stirring up trouble, about letting the past stay buried. They saw Maggie as a threat to the stability of property rights, a dangerous precedent that could unravel decades of transactions. Only a handful stood with them. Old Jim Peterson, who'd lost his own land to questionable dealings years before, testified about Brennan's reputation for exploiting workers. The county judge, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd built her career on uncovering rural corruption, pushed the case forward despite pressure to dismiss it. And Ethan's distant cousin, a paralegal in the city, worked pro bono to organize the mountain of evidence. Through it all, Maggie remained steady as bedrock. She attended every hearing, answered every question with quiet dignity, and never once suggested Ethan should back down to save himself. At night they would sit on her porch, their routine now regardless of the day's defeats, and talk about everything except the case. About the cattle learning to trust her presence, about the garden producing tomatoes sweeter than any she'd grown before, about small moments of beauty that persisted despite the weight of injustice pressing down. It was during these evenings that Ethan fell completely, irrevocably in love with her. Not the dramatic thunder and lightning love of storybooks, but something deeper, the recognition of a soul that matched his own in fundamental ways. Someone who understood that the land wasn't just property, but responsibility, legacy, and promise all woven together. The verdict came on an October morning, with leaves turning gold outside the courthouse windows. Judge Chen's voice was firm as she read her decision. The forged deed was invalid. The northern 40 acres legally belonged to Margaret Collins, and furthermore, Marcus Brennan's estate owed significant damages for a decade of wrongful dispossession. The courtroom erupted. Brennan's remaining family members shouted protests. Their lawyers immediately began discussing appeals. But through the chaos, Ethan only saw Maggie's face, the way tears finally spilled down her cheeks, the way her hand found his and gripped it like a lifeline. They'd won. Against impossible odds and powerful opposition, they'd actually won. This story wouldn't be possible without viewers like you who believe in justice, who believe that the forgotten deserve to be remembered, and who support channels willing to tell these difficult truths. If this journey has moved you, if Maggie's fight has inspired you, please subscribe and share this video. Stories like this need to be told, and your support helps us continue bringing them to light. Thank you for being part of this community. The appeals never materialized. Brennan's children, facing the exposure of their father's fraud and the possibility of criminal charges for knowingly benefiting from it, settled quietly. Maggie received her 40 acres back, plus compensation that, while it couldn't restore the lost decade, at least acknowledged the debt owed. But the real change came from an unexpected direction. Ethan, reviewing the settlement documents with his lawyer, made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He divided his remaining land, giving Maggie full partnership in the ranch operation. Not as charity, not as further restitution, but as recognition of what she'd always been, the true guardian of these plains, the keeper of knowledge that made survival possible. "We rebuild it together," he'd told her when presenting the papers. "Your 40 acres, my land, one operation, equal partners in everything." Now, 4 months after the verdict, they stood on the rebuilt porch of what was no longer just Maggie's cabin, but their shared home. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, not threatening, just the November weather testing the plains' patience. The cattle grazed peacefully in the valley below, the herd grown larger and healthier under Maggie's guidance. Ethan moved closer to her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him naturally, comfortably, two puzzle pieces that had finally found their correct positions. "Another storm coming," Maggie observed, watching the clouds build. "Let it come," Ethan replied. "We know how to weather them now." Thunder rolled across the plains, majestic and fierce. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the landscape in brief flashes of silver light. The cattle shifted restlessly, but didn't panic. They'd learned to trust the shelter and guidance that would always be there. Ethan turned to face Maggie fully, taking both her hands in his. In the storm-lit evening, she looked exactly as she had that first night. Fierce, determined, absolutely real. "You know what I realized," he said softly. "That night in the storm, when I thought you were a mirage, I was half right." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Because mirages are just desperate minds seeing what they need most. And I needed you, Maggie. I needed your strength, your knowledge, your refusal to let injustice win. I needed you before I even knew you existed." He squeezed her hands gently. "You weren't a mirage. You were the answer I'd been searching for in all the wrong places." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was pure sunlight. "And you were the reason I stepped back into the world. The reason I remembered that invisible isn't the same as safe, it's just lonely." The first raindrops began to fall, but neither moved to go inside. They stood together, watching the storm approach with the confidence of people who'd already survived the worst weather could offer. The land stretched out before them, no longer divided by invisible lines of ownership and loss, but unified by shared purpose and hard-won justice. In the valley, the cattle called to each other, secure in their shelter. In the sky, thunder sang its ancient song. And on the porch, two wounded souls found their healing not in forgetting the past, but in refusing to let it define their future. The mirage had become real. The forgotten had been remembered. And in the heart of the Texas plains, where storms tested the strong and broke the weak, Maggie and Ethan stood together, proof that sometimes the greatest miracles are simply people choosing courage when invisibility would be easier.